Thank you, Dr. Nabarra. I hope we can hear me better now. I cut off my introduction speech. I made it shorter because I realized the technology is not working best, and usually when you need it. First, thank you very much for this very deep and wide description of what's happening. And I think it was very important to have a big picture. If I may ask two questions following this, what you just said. First, how you see the international organization role to keep this cooperation in life, because isolation and each of the states doing its own and not having really good coordination is becoming one of the questions with people concerned, because each of the states and each of the region can try to do something themselves. And the second question, why is there so big difference between the different the numbers in different countries? What's the main point? Why in the different countries have a different result? It's a question about infrastructure, it's a question about the different behavior, it's a question of the speed when the government interfere. What the main point? Why in a different region of the part of the world they have a different statistics now? Because many speculations happening around these numbers, and people concerned with this is people not the states not giving the true numbers, or people have no understanding what's going on. Can you just a little bit explain these two elements?
Thank you. Of course, these are really difficult questions you ask, Ruben, and they're things that I'm dealing with all the time. Let me just start with the differences in numbers around the world. Remember that a pandemic like this is made up of a huge number of different outbreaks, and each outbreak has its own characteristics, and the pattern of an outbreak depends hugely on the extent to which there has been a lot of activity and movement at the beginning, because that determines the pattern of spread. And the countries that have been able to interrupt transmission very early, as soon as any little outbreak emerges, are the countries that have been able to have slower doubling rates of their cases. And so we can very quickly see that there is real virtue in that approach. So South Korea and Singapore are showing a different pattern compared with others. Secondly, the numbers are, of course, estimates. They depend hugely on whether or not testing is done. And different countries have adopted different testing strategies. And so interpreting the numbers has to take account of the reality that we are often really a bit blind as to where things are. I don't think it's hiding. And I can't, of course, there will be pressures on certain people to conceal. And even we hear stories of health workers who really badly want to work and to save lives, actually knowing that they might have COVID, but continue working because they feel that they have to do so. So there are some quite strong temptations to conceal at the local level, at the national level, and internationally. But by and large, my approach is to just work with the information we have. Of course, we're seeing that different countries are at different stages. For example, in much of Africa, we believe that still there are quite a lot of small outbreaks and that very effective early action can get them under control. Whereas in Italy, there was a period when transmission was missed. I think that the Italians are prepared to agree to that they didn't quite realize what was going on. And that led to the brewing up of a huge outbreak in northern Italy. And there was also quite a lot of movement in Italy between the north and other parts of the country before the lockdown really started, which seeded the disease into other places. And that has been going on all over Europe, the seeding from places where there's high levels of community transmission. And that means that in Europe now, we are anticipating a number of intense outbreaks suddenly emerging. We'll detect them probably through the flooding of hospitals with cases, because we always have to remember that the current caseload is a sign of transmission that was taking place 10 days ago. And then lastly, I do want to stress to you that we still don't have a full understanding of the susceptibility of different populations. So the story from Italy and Spain. People are saying perhaps one of the reasons for the high mortality rate there is because of the age structure of the population. That, of course, has to be set against the other data that we've got that suggests that the current distribution of people in Italian, northern Italian intensive care units has a slightly younger tail. I'm sorry I can't really fully answer, but all this is about trying to make sense of massive uncertainty and also real variations in data and the kind of data that are available. And so the task at all times is to try to establish a pattern and to be able to communicate that pattern that's based on whatever data are currently available. And of course, because we're having shifted data and an exponential pandemic, the actual judgment about what's happening has to be adapted about every 2 or 3 days. Now, international cooperation. I mean, I want to be absolutely straight with you all, that somebody like me who's worked on global issues quite a lot in my life has always worked hard to ensure that wherever possible, we have complete cooperation between nations that is based on trust and common purpose. Now, we were able to achieve this with Ebola. It took some time and it took a lot of careful confidence building measures. At the moment on this particular COVID, we're right at the beginning of being able to establish strong international cooperation. There are a number of strains in interrelations between global leaders right now, which are based on stuff that's nothing to do with COVID, but they are getting in the way of what is required for a global emergency, which is to have constant communication and unified action with clear principles that are understood and accepted by everybody, and then that are applied with in varying ways in different locations, but all the time keeping the principles in place. So to have a united strategic approach with varied implementation using standard principles has been our collective goal. And WHO has authority to serve as the coordinating body in dealing with an emergency, but that authority depends so much on whether individual governments are prepared to give it the power to take a leadership role. In the run-up to the G20 telephone call that took place on Thursday, it was agreed that WHO and the UN should be present, but it was not agreed that they should be given the authority to draw together everybody, at least for a short period while we're dealing with this emergency. I think this will change because of the speed with which this pandemic is accelerating. Leaders are reassessing their approach and are shifting their view of the need for cooperation over time. But I'm still finding, even today in my discussions with leaders directly or through the media in the last 2 days, we're not quite at the point where that form of cooperation that leads to unified global strategy and implemented in appropriate ways in different locations, we're not there yet. However, I sense that there is a groundswell building, particularly among leaders of countries that are not in the G20 and leaders of groups of countries that are really concerned about the economic and societal damage, that the pressure will build during the next few days on the G20 to just be a little bit more focused on unity. Because if that doesn't happen, then I think we are really going to be hampered in this fight. And I connect wherever possible with those who can have some influence on members of the G20, just stressing what the potential consequences of an inability to be united might lead to. It's no good saying WHO is failing on this. just as a sort of knee-jerk reaction. I had to deal with that today from a number of commentators, because WHO's capacity to combine actors together and get them to unite is limited by the willingness of those actors to do so. So continued dialogue with the leaders of major governments, particularly the P5, and then some of the very populous major economies that are in the wider G20, is absolutely essential through whatever means we can find.